For over a decade, someone was killing and no one knew who it was. Not because there were no clues, not because there were no victims, but because the person responsible looked completely normal. He had a job. He had a home. He had neighbors who saw him every single day, and not one of them ever suspected anything, because nothing about him stood out. Nothing about him seemed dangerous, but just miles away, along a quiet stretch of sand on Long Island, something horrifying was being uncovered. Bodies, one after another, hidden, discarded, left where no one was supposed to look. At first, it didn't seem connected. Different cases, different timelines. But then the pattern started to form. The same area, the same method, the same silence. And the more investigators looked, the worse it became. Because this wasn't just one victim. It wasn't even a few. This was something much bigger. Something that had been happening for years, unnoticed, undisturbed. And the most terrifying part? The person responsible was still out there, living a normal life, watching everything unfold, following the news, knowing that no one had any idea it was him. Until one day, everything started to change.
It started with a search, not for a killer, but for a missing person. In 2010, a young woman disappeared. Her name was Shannon Gilbert. She had been last seen near a quiet, secluded area, close to Gilgo Beach. At first, it looked like another missing persons case. No immediate signs of violence. No clear suspect. Just unanswered questions. But when police began searching the area, they found something they weren't expecting. Not Shannon. Something else. A body. And then another. And another. Within days, what started as a search for one person turned into something much darker. For bodies were discovered, wrapped carefully, placed deliberately, along the same stretch of coastline. They would later be known as the Gilgo Four. Each victim, a young woman. Each one, connected by a pattern investigators couldn't ignore. And suddenly, this wasn't just a missing person case anymore. This was something much bigger. Something organized. Something calculated. Because whoever had done this had taken their time. There was no chaos. No panic. Just precision. And that meant one thing. This wasn't their first time. As the investigation expanded, more remains were found. Not just one or two, but many. Scattered across the same area. Hidden in plain sight. And with each discovery, one question grew louder. How long had this been happening? As more remains were discovered, the case changed completely. This was no longer a search. It was an investigation into a serial killer. The victims shared similarities. Most of them were young women. Many worked as escorts. They had disappeared quietly. No headlines. No urgency. And for a long time, no one connected the cases. But now, the pattern was undeniable. Someone had been targeting them, choosing carefully, moving without drawing attention, and most importantly, leaving almost nothing behind. No witnesses, no clear DNA, just bodies, placed in the same area, which meant something critical. The killer knew that location, not just randomly, but well enough to return again and again, without being seen. Investigators began building a profile, not based on emotion, but on behavior. Whoever was responsible was organized, patient, comfortable taking risks, but only calculated once. This wasn't impulsive. This was controlled. And that suggested something important. He likely had a normal life, a routine, a job, something that allowed him to blend in. Because someone acting randomly doesn't avoid detection for years. Someone like this plans, observes, waits, and then acts only when the moment is perfect. For years, the case stalled. Tips came in. Suspects were questioned, but nothing led to an arrest. And slowly, the investigation lost momentum. Not because it wasn't important, but because there were no answers. And with time, cases like this can fade. But this one never fully disappeared, because the questions remained. Too many victims, too many similarities, too much silence. Somewhere, the person responsible was still living their life, and no one knew who he was. Years passed. Technology improved. Investigative methods changed. And slowly, old evidence started to look different. What once seemed useless now held potential. Digital records, phone data, movement patterns. Everything began to matter again. And this time, investigators approached the case differently. Not just looking at what happened, but how it happened, and who could have done it without being noticed. Because that was the key. Not just the crime itself, but the ability to remain invisible for so long. For years, the case had no clear suspect. Just theories, just possibilities. But that changed when investigators began focusing on one thing: patterns. Not just in the crimes, but in the victims' last known contacts. Because several of them had been in communication with someone. Someone who used disposable phones. Someone who knew how to stay hidden. But even careful people make small mistakes. And this time, one detail stood out. A pattern in phone activity. Repeated locations. Repeated signals. Subtle, but consistent. And slowly, that pattern began to point somewhere. Not to a name yet, but to a place. A place that would eventually lead investigators to the person they had been searching for. The investigation shifted. Instead of looking at victims, they focused on movement, where calls were made, where phones connected to towers. And over time, a location appeared again and again. Not random, not scattered, consistent. And that location was tied to one person. A man who, on the surface, looked completely ordinary. A professional, a homeowner, someone who blended in perfectly, someone no one would suspect. But when investigators looked closer, things began to align. Too many coincidences, too many overlaps. And eventually, coincidence stops being coincidence. His name was Rex Hoyerman, an architect, a man who lived a structured life, who followed routines, who appeared predictable. But behind that routine, investigators believed there was something else. Because the evidence was starting to build. Not enough for an arrest yet, but enough to watch, enough to follow, enough to wait. And that's exactly what they did. They observed him, tracked his movements, analyzed his behavior, looking for something, anything, that would confirm their suspicions. Because they needed proof. And they knew, if they moved too early, they could lose everything. So they waited. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Building a case piece by piece. Collecting evidence carefully. Because this wasn't just about suspicion anymore. This was about certainty. And then, they found something. DNA. Not directly from the crime scene, but from something connected. Something discarded. Something he thought meant nothing. But it was enough. Enough to begin linking him to the victims. And once that connection was made, everything started to fall into place. The charges began to stack. Victim after victim, linked back to him. Each one, a piece of a larger puzzle. And as the case became public, the story spread. Across the country. Across the world. Because people wanted to understand how something like this could happen for so long, without being stopped. But the truth is, cases like this don't always look obvious. They don't always have clear signs. Sometimes, everything appears normal. And that's exactly what allows them to continue. Because people don't expect danger to look like that. They expect something different. Something noticeable. Something they can recognize. But this case proved something else. That sometimes, the most dangerous person is the one no one notices. Even after the arrest, questions remained. How long had it really been happening? Were there more victims? Were there details still undiscovered? Because in cases like this, answers don't come all at once. They come slowly, piece by piece. And sometimes, not at all. What made this case different was not just the crimes. It was the time, the years that passed, without answers, the lives that were lost, without justice, and the fact that, for so long, no one knew who was responsible. Until suddenly, they did, and when everything finally came together, it changed the way people looked at it. Not just as a case, but as a reminder that danger doesn't always stand out, that it doesn't always look obvious, and that sometimes it can exist right in front of you without you ever realizing it. For years, he lived a normal life, undetected, unquestioned, invisible, and that's what made it so terrifying, because it means this wasn't just about what happened. It was about how long it went unnoticed, how easily it was hidden, and how close it was to everyone. Because in the end, the most disturbing part isn't just the crime. It's the realization that no one saw it coming.